I think in another life I would have like leaned into sound design and Foley artists work because
It is
so
just funny when
cool.
you see their like studio and they got all these like instruments and they
I
got all
love
these
it.
random things that they like wobble and like make noises with and little spinners and all kinds of little shit.
So inventive and so like your job is thinking outside the box and listening around and surrounding yourself in interesting like soundscapes.
Yeah, you can just imagine your like day-to-day life and you just hear some random thing and you're like, I must use it.
And you're like, who did that? Everybody stop.
Welcome, friends, to episode 323 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss Brian Helgeland's 2001 film, A Knight's Tale. So we've moved beyond Silo. We're on to a new project now, this one chosen by the patrons. So this is our third quarterly project of 2024, and this is a really fun choice. I'm really glad that this ended up winning. It is maybe the loosest adaptation we've ever covered, but it's at least among the loosest. But it should be a lot of fun to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like our audience knows our bread and butter. Like this, I mean, fantasy, medieval fantasy. It seems. Although I don't know if this is considered fantasy, but it's like fantasy-esque.
Yeah. What is this movie? It's a good question.
Yeah, almost like a comedy, romance, action, medieval sort of film. I appreciate the fact that the patrons wanted us to cover this one because it is just a fun movie. And in doing research for this, I was seeing a lot of the reviews and I was shocked. And maybe this is of when these reviews were coming out, but it's very like middling. And I'm like, This movie at least took a big swing, and I appreciate it for that. And I think I like it a lot, and I think it's great.
I think this movie was ahead of its time, which is funny considering it is about this like classic period. But I think we are even more primed for a movie like this today than we were in 2001.
I was thinking about this too, especially soundtrack wise. Like this is so like just littered with classic rock, all these like massive hits. You think of other soundtrack led films. Recently we had like all the Guardians of the Galaxy movies that were like very awesome mix, and they had like you see it all, quite often I think now, but like I wonder if this paved the way all the way back in 2001 for something like that to happen, because I can't think of many before this that had like a full just playlist outside that were this big of hits. Like of course like you have your Pulp Fictions and some other, like Tarantino was doing a lot of like his own sort of soundtracks to his films, but this is like Queen, David Bowie, AC/DC, like just absolute massive musical artists.
Yeah, and as far as influence goes, I think this also influenced the way that jousting like sequences in a lot of films would be shot, because like the slow motion, like the splinters flying everywhere, guys falling off the backs of horses and stuff. Like maybe this had been done to some extent, but I just have to think this was really influential in what we would see going forward. Because whenever you're shooting a jousting sequence, you probably look to this movie and go like, how did they make this entertaining and exciting to view?
And I have a lot of interesting details about how they shot that. But just from my viewing, which I really enjoyed, by the way, just as a side note, this viewing, I'm like, man, this is so much fun. I feel like this is a movie that you can watch with friends and just like really, just have a great time. These jousting sequences, like there's so much attention to like these shots of the armor and the hands and the specific splintering moments, and like it feels super visceral. Like it feels like it's all really happening. So power to them in 2001 again. Like not a lot of, I mean, there's special effects going on, of course, but stunt people were getting hit by fake jousting spears or whatever you would call it.
I mean, it looked like some dangerous stunts, honestly, and just the way just falling off of horses in general is dangerous. So it looked like real people taking a lot of those falls. So I'm sure they were stunt people, but it's still.
We also got the opportunity to cover this short story, or if you would even call it, it's more of a poem, right?
Yes. So we will get into that. We read The Knight's Tale. We did not read all of the Canterbury Tales. It would have been a big undertaking for this kind of 1 week off project that we're doing here. But I was able to watch some documentaries about them, about Chaucer, and I feel like I got a good sense, without having read them, for what the like general idea is about them and how people feel about them today, how historians feel about them, and why obviously they're still debated to this day. And we'll get into that and how like I do think this is more of an adaptation of Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales in a broad sense, and like almost like an inspiration being drawn from it rather than an adaptation of. In the Knight's Tale in particular, we'll talk about how there's maybe a couple of broad themes you can pull from both, but otherwise pretty unrecognizable. And then I think it was partially just liking the title, although of course they're switching it from The Knight's Tale to A Knight's Tale, which I think is also maybe a purposeful choice to say, hey, this isn't an adaptation of The Knight's Tale. Let's not think it is.
But also I like that moving from the to a, because it's like one of many that you may have heard, I like that.
It's like non-specific.
Yeah. So it sounds like overall you enjoyed your viewing on this film. Like I assume, like me, you've seen it quite a few times over the years.
Well, let's go over history. So also I want to hear your history on Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales.
Yeah, tons of history with that for sure. Yeah. No,
okay. Yeah, I mean, I think I've read a little bit of Chaucer at some class somewhere along the way, like pieces of. I know it's a name that we talked about when we were maybe like studying Middle English way back in probably middle school. I didn't remember basically any of it. I couldn't have told you hardly anything about Chaucer, and the Canterbury Tales in general. Also, didn't really know a lot about them. In fact, I had things about them confused in my mind that I was conflating with some other stuff. So learning about it kind of showed me that this has been kind of a blind spot for me. I mean, yes, it's like a history thing, but it's something that I didn't really know much about, and so it was cool to learn a lot of that. As far as the movie goes, I saw this movie when it came out. I think I saw it in the theaters, and I remember being very excited. This was 2001, so I would have been probably in like ninth grade or so. This was in the summer of 2001, I looked, so this was before 9/11 by several months. Yeah. So it was a different world back then, right? We were all having fun.
No problems before 9/11.
Yeah,
all fun.
Yeah. Well, just the vibe was very different. It was about to change dramatically. Yeah. I remember like enjoying it and liking a lot of the action sequences, but being a little frustrated with, like, I was very into wanting to see like accurate representations of medieval times. I was super into fantasy and still am, but like I was very like I remember being conflicted about the way they blended the modern, music and everything with this medieval time period, but overall having like a good time with it. I know I saw it a few more times over the coming years, and I think like knowing what I was in for helped a lot when I would go to watch it, and it wasn't like, cause I think some of the trailers were misleading for this movie, but if I remember correctly, didn't quite give an accurate representation of what it was. And then I think it grew over time. I ended up saying like, yeah, this is a movie I like for what it is. And then I don't think I've seen this thing in like, I don't know, 15 years or something probably. It's been a long time, and there had been a lot I had forgotten about it. And yeah, so watching it this time, just a completely different experience. I had so much fun with this, and was able to appreciate it as like a version of a chivalric romance that has been made for the masses. And we'll get to that as how like that is kind of an underlying theme of this movie, I think, in general. And in some ways it's deeper than it seems, but also it's not trying to be deep, like it's kind of doing both things. Yeah. And I really appreciate it for that reason. And I think its estimation has only risen after watching it this time. And as far as like one of my favorite comedies, one of my favorite sort of medieval movies, it's risen in the ranks from watching it this time for sure.
Never read Chaucer. But in reading it here for the podcast, it did remind me of reading things like Beowulf or the Odyssey or the Iliad, because you're, especially with the talk of like, I think these are more Roman mythology.
Wait. So you didn't read the like original Middle English, right? We had like a modern English translation. Yeah. That's what I did too. Yeah, because I tried to read a little bit of the actual Middle English, and I was like, this isn't happening. I don't know enough to like make it make sense. So we weren't able to do that, if anybody out there is wondering. We did not read the original Middle English.
Yeah, especially because we were trying to do this coverage in the 1 week format here with the film as well. But just, the talk of like the gods and how they affect the lives of these people like that. I like that kind of storytelling. And I think I can always see it as like that sort of, I don't want to call it rudimentary, but like fundamental sort of storytelling that was going on then that's gone on to have all of this lineage. And like in my reading about the film, like I did see that like Chaucer is known as the forefather of like like modern English or English poetry or something like that in Europe. So like to know that we were reading a story that about someone who's so well regarded that I'm sure you'll tell us more about
I will.
later this episode. It was really cool. So to have that sort of piece of history placed, and then into the film, like basically exactly what you said. Although I liked it right away. Like I think it also hit, I'm younger than you, so it hit at a time where I was like all the way in for this film. Like the action, the romance, the emotional beats all hit. And honestly, they still hit pretty well when I watched it on this viewing. But the cast is amazing. Like Paul Bettany and Heath Ledger in that role, and just on and on. The whole
It's
cast
only
is
gotten more
awesome.
incredible over time now that certain stars have just continued to blossom. And Mark Addy was such a delight to see. And
Oh yeah.
I just keep hearing Robert Baratheon when he talks, and it's so funny because there's like some similarities in the character. It's so funny.
I kept expecting him to be like, get the breastplate stretcher, boy. But just all in all, like the music is fun, but it's in this like very, like you said, kind of innocent early 2000s, like almost rom-com-ish area, and then the action is like there for the quote unquote there for the boys, and the romance is quote unquote there for the girls, and Heath Ledger's a good-looking man, so the girls will enjoy that. And like I can just see how this is like a marketable film, but it is kind of strange and operates in this fantasy medieval space that was going to speak to like basically all demos. And all I know is that a lot of the people that I associate with love this film, and I love this film.
Agreed.
But I was shocked at some of these reviews and stuff that I was seeing for the time.
That's wild. I think this movie is a cult classic for a lot of millennials, and like you were saying, I think a lot of millennial women love this movie. From everything I've been seeing and hearing, and people being excited about us covering it, and just it's got, at times I was reminded of Pride and Prejudice, where this courtly romance is something that people enjoy getting into, and then it's like a really fun take on that, a modern twist on it, which we've seen with shows like Bridgerton and stuff, where we're seeing modern takes on like courtly romances and stuff like that. Now, of course, this is a different time period, but you can see what I'm saying, right? Like we're so more used to that now, I think, than we were back in 2001. So again, I think this movie's a little bit ahead of its time. But so I wanted to start talking. I feel like you kind of left the door open here a little bit, talking about Chaucer, and I want to move into that because there's some really interesting stuff here, and we're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I want to give some context for why this is called A Knight's Tale, why Chaucer appears as like a character in the movie, which like I didn't read about the behind the scenes of the movie, but I'm just like, I'm going to be proposing some theories, right?
Yeah, and of course, just to say for myself, I never realized that this was meant to be the person who wrote the original tale, like in any of my previous viewings. So it's so cool to get that context and be in on the joke now, or in on the
there is some. It does add a little bit, doesn't it? Yeah, it's cool. So The Knight's Tale is one of the Canterbury Tales, and it does deal with what sounds like ancient Greece, which is a little confusing. We got ancient Greek gods, but they're kind of behaving like medieval lords.
Yeah.
And that's
for some
by
reason,
design.
We were also getting Roman gods, like
Maybe I'm conflating Greek and Roman,
because
I don't know,
we got like
sometimes.
Pluto and Mercury
and Mars, and like I don't know. I think some Roman, some Greek. I'm not really sure. I'm not an expert on this stuff. But the whole point is, it was a mythological version of that time period anyway, when Chaucer was writing about it. And what is actually going on here, and this is the context you need for the Canterbury Tales. Canterbury Tales was a manuscript in 10 pieces that was discovered after Chaucer died, I think. I'm pretty sure this is all posthumously found. It is incomplete. So there are chunks of it missing. He also just never finished parts of it. But what it is, and we have the prologue and we have the first tale that's told, and that's the Knight's Tale. So what it is there's a bunch of pilgrims who are on their way to Canterbury. That's why it's called the Canterbury Tales. And they're at this inn. They've stopped at this inn. There's 29 of them. And the innkeeper proposes a contest of tale-telling. And so they all start going around, taking turns, and telling tales. And in the prologue, he sets up, there's this like unnamed narrator who's the pilgrim. And he is both kind of Chaucer, but also kind of not, because there's also like a more omniscient narrator who the pilgrim doesn't seem aware of. So there's some really interesting layered POV things going on here. But so the pilgrim is the one who's like the main person who's observing, and then he's watching these different characters tell their tales. And the knight's tale is the first one told. And what's interesting about these group of people is they represent all these different walks of life. There's people who are in the like merchant class, people who are not, they're like in the noble, like upper crust of society, like the knight. He's one of the most respected people there, but there's no like princes or princes. There's no like, like actual royalty there. But like there's this wide cross section of the middle class and into the upper class. There's people from the clergy. There's there's like the wife of the innkeeper. I think is one of the people who tells the tale. They all tell their own versions of the tales, and they are dramatically different from one another. And yet they seem to kind of comment on one another. And that's shown by the Knight's Tale, which is told about these two men, Palamon and Arcite, are they're cousins and they're warriors, and they have been imprisoned. And from their like prison tower window, they see this woman and they both fall desperately in love with her, decide that they're going to devote the rest of their lives to like trying to get with her. And then also they're going to compete with one another over her. And they end up fighting and all this stuff. We'll get back to that. What's interesting is like the knight tells this tale and it's full of like the chivalric romance, and one of them is doomed by the gods, and it's very like, grand, right? An epic kind of. The next tale that's told is called The Miller's Tale. He's drunk, and he comes in and he interrupts the guy who's going to go next, and he's like, no, I'm going to tell you a tale. And he tells a tale about the miller. It's like this miller's wife. I think she's a miller, or he's a miller, maybe it's a carpenter. But like a lower class person's wife who has an affair with two different guys. And these two guys are competing with each other for her affections. And at one point, like, it's dark and she like hangs her ass out the window, and the one guy comes and kisses it thinking he's going to kiss her. And then he's so mad he goes and gets a poker to like come back and like burn her. But then the guy she's like actually sleeping with like puts his ass out, and when he comes up, he like farts in his face and stuff. So like this is what the other story is, right? And it's very bawdy and like kind of uncouth and like, what is this? And so people have looked at it and said like Chaucer was making a very distinct point here about how the interplay between the classes, and like the miller is making fun of the knight when he tells this tale. It's like, this is a different version of that story. You know what I mean? On the whole, a lot of these tales interplay with each other. But again, this was a fragmented pieces of manuscript they found, so they don't really know all of the ways in which they were supposed to be read, intended by the author, and unfinished. So each person was supposed to tell 4 tales, and I think they only do 2. So it's clear that like it was unfinished. But anyway, so it's kind of it's not only considered one of the like iconic pieces of early Middle English literature. It's also this like mystery, because we don't know exactly what was intended and like how they were supposed to be commenting on one another. So you got a lot of scholars coming in and going like, I think this one was supposed to be read after this one because of this particular statement it might be making, right? Yeah. But what's cool about it is it shows that Chaucer was very aware of the differences in classes and the differences in the walks of life for people in that time period and how they viewed one another. And he was trying to write this like over-encompassing work that showed off a lot of that and was broadly considered a comedy. Like a lot of this was intended to be funny and very satirical, like making fun of different people. So like if you read The Knight's Tale in and of itself, it seems very serious. But when you take it in context of what the miller says next, it's clear that there is some satirical things going on here where we're sort of making fun of that tale.
Yeah, that totally changes the read because, like I said, I was almost comparing it to like the Odyssey or something like that, which is like very serious and
the knight is very serious, and he tells this very serious tale about these two. Yeah, so that's like the context of what's being told.
And then having the next part and knowing that's probably again where filmmaker here says, oh, there's a lot more to this story. I'm going to take this specific one, split pieces out, and blend in sort of the satire and the other elements of the story. I mean, it's cool to note that because, like I said, I was thinking of this as like a straightforward story. But it's like knowing that it's more layered, I can already see where people are getting at with the idea of like the father of modern English, literature or something like that. Yeah.
So one of the reasons they call him that is up until this point in time, poetry was definitely a thing, but poetry was written in Latin, largely. He was one of the first people to take this like kind of new version of English that was around, Middle English, and say, I'm going to write poetry in this language. And this was already a language more for the masses. So this was in and of itself kind of a like bold thing to do. And then he literally is like inventing poetry in this language. And he comes up with these rhyming couplets. And I saw there's like hundreds of words that have been like originally traced to him. This is 200 years before Shakespeare, by the way.
Damn.
So this guy's before Shakespeare by a long time. And yeah, I mean, that's why like they say like this is maybe the first like English poet, because he was the first one to say, I'm not going to write my poetry in Latin. I'm going to write it in English.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And of course, if you know a lot more about the Canterbury Tales, feel free to correct me in the comments, but be gentle because again, this is a pretty rapid thing and I'm just trying to present it in really broad strokes here. But yeah, I mean, one of my takeaways from reading this is just how Chaucer, from what I was reading, also he was born into like a merchant class, and then he went and he ended up working for, I think, a duchess. And so he sort of, in like himself, crossed from a more middle class to a more upper class. And so he had a wide range of friends and experiences as he traveled and went to these different areas to where he could touch on like people from all different walks of life. And he had that perspective of like there is differences between how the different classes live. And he had himself risen through the ranks. And I think when you look at that and you look at this version of A Knight's Tale, you can see that a lot of those themes are carried over too, as we see, this is primarily about a lower class character who's trying to jump up into sort of an upper class nobility of being a knight. But there's also the fundamental question of like, is a knight something that is you are born with, right? It's like something in your blood, you have been blessed by God. Or is it something more about knightly ideals? And Is that what a true knight is? And are the people who claim to be knights, if they don't follow those ideals, are they actually knights or not? And that is a very modern interpretation in some ways of knightliness. But it was something that Chaucer played with from what I was reading. Like these were questions that people can see in his work as characters who have these higher social standings and are telling these tales. There's like priests and stuff telling tales of piety and godliness, and then you're like, this is in the same book essentially as these more like body tales, and it's like, what is he trying to say? And what is it just like a cross section? But it seems like there were deliberate choices made about the way these stories inform one another. In some way, the themes that I'm seeing across a lot of these stories and how they interplay with each other and they conflict with one another, I've seen some of that come out in the movie too.
Yeah, so you could say Chaucer kind of changed his stars in a sense because he.
Yeah. So and it's funny too because he makes him a character, right? He's like, I'm going to put him in the movie as a character. But one of the things that it reminded me of is, I don't know if you noticed this when you were reading, but there are times where it seems like the narrator just kind of talks to the listener or reader, because a lot of these were kind of oral tradition stories anyway, where a lot of people who would be enjoying them couldn't read, so they were often listening to them being performed. And there's a lot of moments where it's like, we're going to address the audience now.
Yeah, and I did notice that. I just assumed it was a mechanism of the storytelling. I didn't know this larger sort of framing device was
But
there.
what's cool is like that ties into the version of Chaucer we see in the movie, right? Who's like constantly talking to the audience and like in kind of ways breaking the fourth wall often. And in a way that Chaucer literally did in his writing often, where he like addresses the audience.
That's cool. Yeah. A lot to talk about with Chaucer in the film because I mean, to do an insert of an author like that, you hope that you're well researched in that. And I think Helgeland did that research from all accounts, and kind of tongue in cheek threaded him in some ways. But supposedly in my research, Chaucer went missing. There's like a year of his life.
Yeah,
it was like
this is like the unaccounted for year.
Exactly. So this film is meant to represent that year where nobody knows what he was up to. He's fucking around with William and this whole group here.
I like that. What was your general take on reading The Knight's Tale, by the way? Like, were you able to enjoy it? Was it too sort of old-timey?
Well, I talked about it a little bit in the comparison to the other like classic literature. I think it's kind of a fun historic sort of exercise to go back and read where these things come from. And I find that to be fascinating, so I enjoyed it. It is a fairly simple tale as far as just the section that we read, The Knight's Tale. And it's not breaking ground as far as a modern reader would say.
Yeah,
just
it's very old-timey.
You've seen this story before. You know what it's going to be like. But I did when they did like a full introduction of like the gods and them talking to each other and them fighting. Basically, I was like, oh shit! Like this took on another level of emphasis.
The gods just randomly decide they like one guy over the other.
It's like Mars and Venus, I think, are at war with each other, and then like I forget Saturn or somebody like intervenes, and yeah, it's very interesting. And then ultimately at the end, Pluto, I think, creates an earthquake that kills one of the two of them. Arcite is, I think, praying to like Mars, and he wants to win the battle, and he's like praying to basically the god of war. Palamon is praying to Venus, I believe, who is like Aphrodite type character, which is like the goddess of love kind of thing.
I think
So he's
you're
wanting
testing
to.
my knowledge of these. I know I have played
Yeah.
Hades, the video game. I remember
Yeah, I
some
know,
from that.
but that's what I mean. Like, I think that's Greek mythology. This is also Roman mythology. From the version we read, they were using like the planetary, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars.
I get them confused a lot anyway, because a lot of them are the same. They just renamed them.
Exactly, they're similar. There's some different stories and stuff, but so anyway, they're fighting. Saturn intervenes. Pluto creates the earthquake. Palamon is praying to Venus because he wants to just fall in love with this woman and be with her. The other guy's praying for like victory in battle. So it's like his you can kind of see that as like he wanted to win the war more than he wanted to win her love, and then ultimately he's the one who's like struck down. Both gods were like they did right by their person who was praying to them, because he did win the battle but ultimately was randomly killed, and then the other character, Palamon, went on to win the love of and affection. And I think the woman also was praying to, what's her name, Emily, was praying to a god who said, you won't be forced into a marriage without love or something like that, and then ultimately makes good on it. So at the end, happy ending for everyone except for the character who died from just a random earthquake on horseback. He's like won the battle and he's excited. Earthquake, boom, he falls and he ultimately dies. And then at the end there is that chivalrous sort of knight moment where he's like, be with my rival. He's my cousin. I love him.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really, very knightly. The whole thing goes down in that way.
And I see some similarities here with what happens in the movie in some ways, with the two people who are in love with the same woman, if you want to call it love, for our villain. In another way, you can see that conflict between wanting to win the tournament and wanting to have like, best other knights on the field of battle versus caring more about love, and how that becomes like a key moment in the movie, to where you can see how there maybe is some things that Helgeland was able to bring over.
Yeah, I mean, you even have our villain in the film at one point is like, he's ranking like trophies, horses, and then women, and like you could tell that he doesn't care about this woman's love. It's like she's like a trophy to be won like actually for him. And I think you can argue that like our main character William goes through like some change over time, because at first he's all about the love, then he's all about the winning, and then he comes back around to being invested in courting Jocelyn.
So I think if you're ready, man, let's move into this movie. There's a lot of things to get to with this, and I'm really curious. I didn't look into the background of like how this movie was made and any of that stuff. So I'm curious what you've got for me there.
Yeah, well, first I'll tell you a little bit about the filmmaker. Brian Thomas Helgeland is an American screenwriter, film producer, and director. He's best known for writing the screenplays for the films L.A. Confidential and Mystic River. He also wrote and directed the films 42, a biopic of Jackie Robinson, as well as the medieval action comedy A Knight's Tale. His work on L.A. Confidential earned him the Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay.
That's one we could cover, by the way. L.A. Confidential is a really cool movie. I also really like Mystic River.
L.A. Confidential is one that I've told you forever that I had never seen when we started the podcast, like however many years ago now. I'd never seen it, and I would have seen it up to this point had it not been for the podcast.
You still haven't seen it?
I still haven't seen it. I'm waiting to watch it for the podcast.
We need to do L.A. Confidential because it's a good movie. I mean, like Kevin Spacey's in it, so it's kind of unfortunate. But the movie's good, and it would be worth looking at. And I think the book is supposed to be really interesting and part of a larger body of work that is a blind spot for me that I do want to learn more about.
So interestingly, Helgeland started as a writer and then moved his way into directing, as well as writing some of the things that he directs. So he was born in Rhode Island to Norwegian-born parents and was raised in nearby Bedford, Massachusetts. He majored in English at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, before following his father's work fishing scallop. One cold winter day in 1985 made Helgeland consider another job after finding a book about film schools. He eventually settled on a career in film, considering his love for movies. Eventually, after graduation, his agent arranged for him to meet with Rhett Thompson, who had an idea for a horror comedy film, but was having difficulty writing it. The resulting film was 976 Evil, which the duo managed to sell for $12,000. 976 Evil marked the directorial debut of Freddy Krueger portrayer Robert Englund, who went on to recommend Helgeland as New Line Cinema wanted to do a Nightmare on Elm Street film. Helgeland was paid $70,000 to do what would become a Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master. He would go on to write Highway to Hell and The Ticking Man, and it was making more money for writing those scripts. And The Ticking Man was actually written but never made, and that sold for $1 million between him and his co-writer on that script, which, like, obviously he's successful at that point just as a writer. He was interesting. In 1998, he won both an Academy Award and a Razzie the same year. Different films, one for LA Confidential, one for The Postman. Only one person had previously achieved this dubious feat. It was Alan Menken in 1993, and only one other has done it since, Sandra Bullock in 2010.
So he wrote The Postman? He adapted that? 'Cause that's another adaptation that we could cover. I think it's a Larry Niven novel.
That would be really cool. This is such a fun story. He accepted the Razzie and became only the 4th person in its history to be personally presented with the statuette. He keeps the statues of both the Oscar and Razzie on his mantle as, quote, a reminder of Hollywood's idealistic nature and unrealistic expectations. He apparently has worked on an unproduced adaptation of Moby Dick. So he is something out there where we could see a possible Moby Dick adaptation, which would be cool.
Yeah, it sounds like it's just kind of wild that we haven't really covered this guy's stuff before when he's been involved in so many things.
A bunch of stuff, yeah.
Yeah.
And then recently, I think this is just something that people who like A Knight's Tale and you and I, being fans of this work, would want to know. In May of 2017, HBO announced that Helgeland is one of 4 writers working on potential pilots for Game of Thrones spin-offs. So after the series ended, Game of Thrones ended, he was, trying to create these spin-offs. I think that's outside of House of the Dragon. I think the one that was eventually selected, because HBO said due to the massive logistics involved, they were only going to pick one of the pitches to go into full production, ended up being a Hedge Knight, which would be really cool when that comes out.
Is that the one he's working on, Hedge Knight?
No, he.
There's a Knight of Two Kingdoms or something I thought was just announced, right?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure about that.
Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. What is that?
That's the Hedge Knight, yeah, which is Duncan Egg.
Okay, yes. So Knight of Seven Kingdoms is the one that is happening, and that's not Helgeland, though.
That's not. So I'll tell you what his was going to be about. Because I think as a Song of Ice and Fire fan, you'll think it's cool. So his pitch centered on the Rhoynish Queen Nymeria, which would later develop into 10,000 Ships is what it was going to be called.
Right, yeah, I remember hearing about that one. Okay, interesting. So that was the one he was working on. That's cool.
I'll just read a little bit about what he said. It came out great, but I think they felt the period of my show was too far removed from the pillars of the original. That's why it hasn't been picked up, but nothing is ever dead. He went on to say that like he worked with George R. R. Martin, talked to him, pitched the idea, got his blessing. It was kind of like Ray Harryhausen's Sinbad films mixed with the Odyssey, is what he said. In a way, Nymeria is Odysseus, but instead of a 12-person crew, she's responsible for every citizen in this floating city-state. My work is still there. If HBO wants to pick it up, I enjoyed my time developing it. You just never know. So, could see something Game of Thrones related from this guy in the future. Helgeland has talked about what he intended with this film, and he wanted to show, like I said, what he may have been doing when he wrote the Canterbury Tales. And I found it kind of interesting that he talks about how anachronistic this is because of you're getting the modern music and some modern influence, like the camera work too, which we can talk about, some of the canted angles and like it felt very like handheld and modern in a lot of ways. It wasn't like locked off, which a lot of like very serious medieval work is. And then you're getting that music and everything. And he said that many pop culture references and a soundtrack featuring 1970s music that was very anachronistic. So what he set out to do with some of this was to like emphasize what audiences of like a medieval joust may have felt hearing different kinds of music. So in order to like put ourselves in the shoes of characters that are in the film, he's playing modern music that would elicit a response from modern music.
It had like sort of the atmosphere of going to a football game in America, right? And that was by design, I think, to show that it was a similar sort of sporting event in a lot of ways.
He said that when true Renaissance music is used in modern movies, it fails to convey the emotional response that people back then had to such music. So like they're responding, like if there's a song that you love that's a modern song, imagine being, a peasant back in medieval times and hearing something like that and just how moving that would have been.
I think that's a really cool, bold thing to do. And the movie loudly announces that. Like, it says from the beginning, as soon as that needle drop happens, where all of a sudden We Will Rock You's playing, and everybody's like jamming out to it, and people are pounding their their breastplates and rocking out. And then it even like has the horns look like as if they're like playing the electric guitar, and then they put it down right when it ends. Like the movie is like loudly saying, "This is the kind of thing you're in for." So in some ways, like I feel like it is telling us, don't judge it on basis of historical accuracy. This is kind of a fairy tale. This reminds me a little bit of like Shrek in a weird way, like how Shrek also plays with that and says like, this is a fairy tale, but we're going to make some modern jokes in here too. It's not about historical accuracy. And that's kind of how this feels. And it's like, it feels kind of silly to hold it to that standard. And I think a lot of the critics did for whatever reason. A lot of people were like, mad that this did what it did.
Shrek is a great comparison. I hadn't even tried to make that connection because it is talking about, it's doing it with like fairy tales and nursery rhymes and that kind of thing, but it's also doing it with like sort of medieval and fantasy elements, and using that soundtrack. And right around the same time, I think Shrek is like 1999 or 2000, somewhere right in there. You were talking about that opening scene with the music playing, We Will Rock You, there's jousting going on. And I did want to note, the first scene of the two knights jousting is actual footage of an accident involving Heath Ledger's stunt double. While filming a later scene, the opponent's lance moved off target. The stunt double was hit in the head and fell to the ground unconscious. The entire scene was used for the introduction.
Wow.
So you would assume that the stunt person, like having recovered from whatever, if there was any injuries or whatever, you would assume that they gave their blessing. We're like, put it in the movie. Like,
I mean, I feel like, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I've heard stunt people talk about that. Like if I got hurt in the damn sequence, you might as well use it.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Cause I mean, it's almost worse if you got hurt in something and then they don't even use that take. And then you're like, well, come on.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's like, you're there for that. And so for that sacrifice to be made, like at least it made the cut. That's It's as long as everything else worked out in the
I'm
tape.
sure there are lines to that, of course.
Sure. Oh yeah, if it's like anything.
How serious is it? Yeah.
Super serious, of course. While we're talking about jousting, because I think we're gonna get into the plot here in a second, but a lot of effort, we've talked about like the look of it and the jousting sequences. A lot of effort was put into creating the lances that would splinter convincingly without obviously hurting stunt riders. The body of each lance was scored so it would break easily. Tips were made of balsa wood. And then each was hollowed out and filled with balsa chips and uncooked linguine to make the convincing splinters.
Uncooked linguine. That's hilarious. That's so funny.
And then also like the sound, every time that impact was hitting one of the actors or one of these stunt actors, that crunching sound and the like almost explosion, it was so affecting. And the sound design elements were really strong in this film. But apparently that sound of the actual impact is a howitzer being fired. But they to get that long crunching impact, they like slowed it down by half or something like that. So every time it's hitting, it's actually like a giant cannon basically going off. And I think it adds a lot.
Sound people behind these movies are just freaking wizards, man. The way we talked about like how the T-Rex roar was made in Jurassic Park, and like how many different iconic sounds were made in Lord of the Rings, and just like the stuff that people come up with to get these sounds. And it's something that's so unique and so iconic.
I think in another life, I would have like leaned into sound design and Foley artists work because it is so
just funny
cool.
when you see their like studio and they got all these like instruments and they got all these random things that they like wobble and like make noises with and little spinners and all kinds of little shit.
So inventive, and so like your job is thinking outside the box and listening around and surrounding yourself in interesting like soundscapes.
Yeah, you can just imagine your like day-to-day life and you just hear some random thing and you're like, I must use it.
And you're like, who did that? Everybody stop now. I loved this specific reference because It makes sense, and there's a reason that Monty Python did it. But for the scene when William follows Jocelyn into the cathedral, the sound of his horse's hooves was produced with coconuts on a garage floor. So
Perfect.
it's real.
Perfect.
The coconuts,
That's amazing.
Galloping around.
Oh, man,
reference to. I mean, I feel that it's a possible reference to Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Yeah, I mean, that's hilarious. I mean, an audio reference, is that a thing? But yeah, I guess it is, right? You have the Wilhelm
I mean, that's where I would go
right?
first, right? I'd be like, let me see if coconuts actually work, and then go from there.
It's a good starting place.
All right, so let's get into the plot here so we can talk characters, we can talk the story overall. At a jousting tournament in 14th century Europe, squires William, Thatcher, Roland, and Watt discover that their master, Sir Ector, has died. With one more pass, he could have won the tournament. Destitute, William wears Sir Ector's armor to impersonate him, taking the prize. Although only nobles are allowed in tournaments, William is inspired to compete and win more prizes. Roland and Watt would rather take their winnings and leave, but William convinces them to stay and help him train. While traveling, they encounter a young Geoffrey Chaucer, who is also destitute and agrees to forge a patent of nobility so William can enter, assuming the name of Sir Ulrich von Liechtenstein from Gelderland. During the competition, William's armor is badly damaged. He goads Kate, a female blacksmith, into repairing it without payment. He wins the tournament's sword event, enabling him to pay Chaucer's debt. In the joust, he faces Sir Thomas Colville, who withdraws from the tournament after being injured by William, though they exchange a ceremonial pass so that Colville can retain the honor of never having failed to complete a match. The proceedings are observed by Jocelyn, a noblewoman with whom William has become infatuated, and Count Adhemar of Anjou, a rival both in the joust and for Jocelyn's heart. In the final joust, Adhemar defeats William. William vows revenge, but Adhemar taunts him, quote, "You have been weighed, you have been measured, and you have been found wanting."
What a great opening. Yeah, I mean, so much to react to here. I think let's bring it all the way back to that opening sequence. And it immediately sets the tone for like the clever wordplay and like mix between kind of modern sensibilities and this like older way of speaking, where when they're talking about the dead knight, and he's like, his spirit is gone, but his stench remains. Like he's like, what are you not getting? He's dead. Like
it's so good funny. Too because it sets the tone, right? Like very very much like sets the comedic tone, and how like it's darkly funny, and they're like the Watt is like kicking and beating the shit out of this guy. And it's so funny because in previous viewings, I should have, but this viewing, I realized like we see that knight later in a flashback.
Yeah, that's him.
And we're like, oh, he seems like a cool enough guy. And they're just fucking kicking him. And like, this is like, I don't know. It was funny the way they were talking about him.
Yeah, definitely. But, we meet Will, and he's got this beard and he looks very different. But it's really cool. And, he takes on the armor, gets his face smashed in, so the first bit of like physical humor really happens here, where he's got the bent helmet, he can't take it off, but it works out well, right? I love all of that. You got the needle drop, which I already talked about. There's this speech about like, what are we gonna do? Like we can try and rise above our station, or we can just go back, and live as we are. And yet they're talking this way, and there's like these dead bodies hanging above them, very ominously, right? And Mark Addy's character even points to them and is like, that's what lays ahead for us. So it's not like it's super subtle, but I think there's just smart things happening there. And then of course when they encounter Chaucer, that like adds a whole new dimension of like kind of metatext that's going on now, where all of a sudden it feels kind of like this is Chaucer's tale to me. And I think at times it doesn't go all the way there to imply that the story you're watching is in fact his tale, but it kind of feels like it is. And I just love the way he sort of commands, he's in such command of the scenes he's in, and yet he's standing there completely nude, right? Like, and covered in shit, it seems like. Such a great character introduction, and Paul Bettany here is just killing it.
Paul Bettany, he's such a well-written character, so clever, so funny. Yeah. That introduction of having like a naked Chaucer
Trudging.
walk in. I'm like, it's iconic. It's to me. I'm like, I think of this scene and I'm like, it's so bold and funny, and we come to find out that he's like gambled away his like literally the clothes off his back. Yeah. So he's naked in the scene.
And the road to ruin joke, because they're going to a place called Ruin. I feel like that's such a medieval like wordplay joke to make too.
Yeah, and I think that it was like it's pronounced like slightly different from that. but it's like Rowan or something.
But he reacts to it. He's like, "Oh, it's yet to be seen."
We'll see, yeah, because it's
Yeah,
kind of a double entendre of like they're actually going to this place called Rowan or Ruin.
yeah, so good. And then the Fong Yu stuff.
Yeah.
It's so. I feel like he almost broke. What's that actor's name?
Tudyk, Alan Tudyk.
Alan Tudyk. I feel like he almost breaks in that scene where he's like yelling at him and saying his entrails will be extrails and all this stuff. Like I see them,
Yeah.
I see him starting to crack, but they use they like use that take anyway because it was just so funny.
One of my favorite things about Alan Tudyk too is he's like a classically trained actor. Like I forget where he went, but he's like a thespian.
It's like
and
he could almost play the Chaucer role here.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
But he like, and he just brings like such a energy to a lot of the scenes that he's in. I think Alan Tudyk's awesome, and he's really funny in this. It's just again Paul Bettany, Alan Tudyk, Mark Addy, Heath Ledger, obviously. Which I mean, just to address that, like what a tragedy it is that this guy's not around anymore. You know, we saw obviously his Joker and
Yeah.
quite a few other roles,
Gosh,
but
just an aside about him, like he's so good in this role, and he plays such a sort of heartthrob, warm, lovable guy that seems so heroic and so pure in this movie that I think this was one of the things that, because I feel like The Dark Knight was announced not much long after this. I'm not sure the exact year, but like I remember people looking at this and going like, this guy's going to play the Joker. And the internet lost their minds and everybody gets super pissed. And that's why I always think about when people get really mad about when casting gets announced, how like you just don't know what people are going to be able to do.
Well, I remember people being so hateful. Specifically because of Brokeback Mountain, which is an excellent movie.
Yeah, you're right.
And something else we can, and it was like people were being so hateful, just coming out of the woodwork about that movie, and again, great movie. I think we could cover that for the podcast as well. But I think about like 10 Things I Hate About You is like the first time I think I became aware of him. He's in like The Patriot, this movie. He had such like, you can see the trajectory, especially with his Joker, of like, if he lives, of like how he's like a Leonardo DiCaprio right
Such
now,
a
maybe,
talent,
or someone
man.
like that.
He was just getting into the prime of his performance, I think.
So it's sad. And he seems like a cool guy too. Whenever people would, he was an advocate for like, LGBTQ rights, and like I remember like with the Brokeback Mountain stuff, like people would ask him just inappropriate questions, and he was always like, he seemed like a pretty cool guy. So overall, in terms of like his beliefs and stuff. So sucks that he's gone. It's fun to watch movies like this that he was in though. So.
Yeah, I mean it's cool that he was able to make something, and make a bunch of movies that have I think stood the test of time, and this is definitely one of them. I think this is among his canon of like his best movies.
The actress who played Jocelyn hasn't been in a ton of things outside of this film that I've seen.
She
Shannon,
kind of familiar. Like
she's in some other stuff for sure. I can't place it exactly right now, but I had such a crush on this character growing up. In A Knight's Tale.
It was really fun the way she like plays. Her dress is so anachronistic too. Like that's
the different colored hair, the like alternative kind of like look, and just like her attitude in the film.
Clothes that
like,
would have been perceived as extremely scandalous, of course.
Yeah. But she kills it. She's really good in the film as well, and she carries like the weight of this character, right? Like she's like somewhat this love interest, but she's also like seemingly has this high station, and she's like, I love the way she interacts with like the theocracy or whatever. That's whatever she's like. I think Christianity
touching a little bit on some of the themes from the Canterbury Tales, right? I don't know. I was picking up on some of that. Yeah, she's great, man. It's funny because I will say like, I'm going to have a few like minor criticisms for this movie. I think one of the things is that this movie's sort of attitude around the gender dynamic is very early 2000s.
Oh yeah.
Because like you can like carbon date this thing to the way we're like playing with like, oh, she's kind of like pushing back against the patriarchy, but like only in certain ways, and it's all presented as kind of a joke. And she's still this like sex object that the men are chasing after, and she's like okay with that ultimately. Like it's just like it's a very particular time where it's like society was trying a little bit to move in certain directions, but like falling so short and shy of it in other ways. And like it's kind of endearing now. And it's not like the worst example of this I've seen or anything. It's just like, for me, it feels like this is the most, early 2000s thing about this movie is the way we deal with like men and women.
Yeah, like I said, it feels like a rom-com from the early 2000s. Like it just, the way that they treat all of the relationship stuff and the romance element of it. And it's not inherently bad, but it's not like progressive by any
It's not. No, it's not. It's like it's we're having fun with the idea of feminism, and like this character can like in some ways push back on her station in life, but not in any like meaningful way usually. Right, like it's all kind of in good fun.
At one point Adamar is like negotiating for her to be forced to marry him and stuff, and like it seems like that would be something she's not able to push back on. But like she has the agency, like the character has agency, but it seems like, again, if William had stepped in, which like he's kind of her hero for that.
Yeah, ultimately it's still about him winning her heart, and like the way he has to like perform his love to her and everything. Now, part of this is also we're telling a chivalric romance, so it gets kind of mixed up in that, which of course is a very dated look at this. But certain lines, the way that other guys talk about her, when they're like trying to prepare him to like go dance with her and everything, like.
So the letter that they write, I felt, and maybe this is endearing, but I think like a bunch of dudes writing a love letter to someone isn't as personal. What's that? Oh yeah, Kate's there as well. A bunch of people helping him write it feels like less directly his own emotions and stuff, and kind of weird that it's like almost like Cyrano de Bergerac type thing where like they're speaking through him to like win over this love.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to bite him, right? Because the first time she sees him, she's like, "Talk to me, with your poetry again," and he's like, "Your breasts are beneath your throat," so like he fucks it up immediately. It was pretty funny. I like that it kind of goes back to the Canterbury Tales, right? A bunch of different people telling their stories and how they kind of come together to form this one. This one bit of poetry, which again, whenever there's poetry sort of played within this movie, it reminds me of that too, right? But yeah, I mean, so we get some awesome action sequences. We get the introduction of Adalmar, who is Rufus Sewell here, who he just plays these like villainous characters so well. My wife watched this with me. When I told her we were covering it, she was very excited. She loves this movie. She's seen it a bunch of times.
Cool.
Remembers it super well, like can quote it and everything. We were talking about him, and I'm like, it's like he's one of those guys who's just been typecast his entire career. Something about they look at his face and they're like, he's a bad guy. And you always like wonder like people like that, like how are they in real life? Are like are they actually just super nice people? Like I don't know. But he's got like some sort of brow. His eyes are like a little bit crooked, but he has a very intense gaze. And Hollywood sees that and is like, you're gonna be a villain in every movie you're in.
Yeah.
I mean, there's probably a few where he hasn't been. I'm not like a master of his his entire body of work, but still, I feel like I've seen him as a bad guy in many a movie.
He at least has like an intimidating presence. So he's not going to play some like meek character.
He's dark. He's got dark hair, dark eyebrows, that kind of look, which like, hey, I empathize with. I look that way.
Yeah. By the way, speaking of just like the introduction of characters and that Chaucer introduction scene where he's nude, apparently that was the first day of shooting in front of a crowd of extras.
Oh, boy.
Also, there's this moment where Chaucer, like when he's first introducing William or Sir Ulrich for the joust, he says he like addresses the crowd and he's like, and for anyone else here not sitting on a cushion, kind of thing. Like
again, that goes back to actual Chaucer, who was telling tales for everybody.
The class system, obviously, they are reacting. The higher class are reacting. They're like, what the hell is happening right now in this introduction? And the way that he's like weaving words and he's this like orator. And then, but apparently this is also a reference to the Beatles' Royal Command performance in 1963 when John Lennon introduced the last song by saying, quote, "For the people in the cheaper seats, clap your hands. And the rest of you, if you just rattle your jewelry."
That's why I haven't heard that quote before. I like it.
Yeah, that's cool.
I like that, and I like that this also kicks off a fun little thing you can track if you're sort of paying attention to the side characters. Is the little competition that starts to happen between the heralds and how the other guy, the Adamar's herald starts mimicking some of the things that he sees Chaucer do. And when like
Yes.
later times when
Yes.
he's introducing him, he starts borrowing certain things because he's like, oh, he's doing it better than me. And I like that is sort of followed through. And then at the end, I think he even claps. So it's kind of showing that like he was a fan. I don't know. I like that stuff too.
It's just clever. Like the Paul, like what a role for Paul Bettany. Like that's like a career definer in some ways. Like I just see him as like a young actor, just like frothing at the mouth for a role like this, to get to just like shout to the audiences and be so performative.
What a fun thing to perform. And I love it. You know, he says, you know, I'm a writer. I give the truth scope. And then he goes out and just lies. So it's so funny because like he has like they do a clever thing where he is being threatened by these two guys. They're gonna like kill him or something if he doesn't pay him back. And
because he's a gambling addict.
And Will has this moment where he's like, I'm going to promise to pay you guys back. And he wins over Chaucer in this moment, right? So now he's 100% behind Will and becomes like indebted to him. And so when he comes out, he's really giving it his all and he's playing it up really, really, you know, like to a crazy level. Like at one point he's like, he spent a year in Greece contemplating the sound of a whisper, you know, like really just funny stuff. And you're just like, but also, like, it's kind of true, and this is the thing I love about it, too, is a lot of, like, when you would hear about these knights, it was always about, like, how devoted they were to God, and, like, how devoted they were to contemplation, and then they were also great warriors. Like, they're supposed to be these warrior poets, right? And so he's playing all of that up, but, of course, it's all lies. So it's really funny in the moment, too. Just, I don't know, just, like, the dramatic irony of the whole thing is amazing.
Yeah. Well, and it gets back to what you were talking about with the Chaucer tales, where it's like the idea of like honor or status, station, like do you deserve all that you've been given on one side of the fence or the other, and like that's kind of the point of the William character too.
Well, and how also like we don't know if any of this is true for anybody when people tell these kind of stories. Like it's just shit people say.
But you get this like, you know, very Rocky-esque story, right? Where you have this guy like this underdog, and he's come from nothing, and he's building his way up just by sheer force of will and a dream. And it's fun. It's fun to cheer for. It's, you know, it's not a super complex story, but you're gonna get invested. And I think the music does it for you, and a lot of the like the character work is strong. Those flashbacks, I think. I underestimated the flashbacks in previous viewings. I was like, especially the stuff with his dad, I'm like, is it a bit predictable? Yes, but the idea of like the dad having to give him over to be a squire to give him a better life, and he like works his way up and then finds his moment and becomes this like champion sort of hero. It works. I think it works for this kind of story. And like his dad has done they sacrificed together to be in the scenario that they're in now, and that moment where like he's champion, which I'm jumping ahead a bit, but he gets to hear his own name in shouted all through England as Sir William is it's cool.
So it was one of my stumbling blocks a little bit. Like I'm of two minds about it. On one hand, it is a powerful emotional beat. On the other hand, it definitely dances across the line into maudlin territory to me, where it's like it's a bit much. And it's the way it's presented with the music and the rain and the blindness, and it's like, okay, but I find it hard to hold it against the movie when the movie has been telling us from the beginning, we are taking a knightly romance with all of its big, epic themes, and we're packaging it in a way for the masses. And not just the masses of the time in the movie, but the masses today, right? Like this is a movie that's being made for the masses of the world. And you don't have to be some high-minded art critic. You don't have to be people who study, books and movies on a podcast to be able to appreciate this. Like it's something that is for the common people, and unabashedly so by design. And so something being a bit maudlin to me might just land perfectly well to some people, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that the movie is leaning into that and saying like, it's okay. This is what we're going for. We're having broad jokes. We're having, humor that's accessible to all. We're gonna, have an emotional beat that is just incredibly heavy-handed. But it's okay.
And I don't know, like it's funny that like you're talking about like general for the masses, and it's kind of a fun movie, but it also has this like historic kind of twist to it in a sense. At least it's got the medieval elements. I remember like for whatever reason when I hit high school, this started to be a movie that would be rolled out on TVs or whatever to be shown in like an English class or something, or a history class, when you're like it's, we can't, substitute teacher kind of thing. They show up and they're putting A Knight's Tale on, and I always thought it was so funny because I'm like, this is a cool movie. I like this movie. I mean, maybe in an English class you could at least argue like Chaucer's there, and there's like something, something that going on there.
I don't think I ever watched this movie in school, man. You had some cool subs, I guess.
But yeah, them putting this on, I was always like, I guess this is a history movie or English movie for public school. But for that audience, it does kind of feel almost like an amusement ride or something like that. Like it's just like, it's going to cater to the masses. It has some cool jousting, some historic elements that I think people can use as like a jumping off point. If it's like I don't know, one of the first fantasy-ish or like medieval films that you've seen, like you can watch this and then move over to something more dramatic and serious and maybe more accurate to history or something like that,
if you want. I mean, this gets back to the heart of something that we've talked about time and again on this podcast in different ways. It's the interplay between the like broad popular art, right, the stuff that people call genre, like they call mainstream, versus the like more, artistically like sort of elevated art house, things like that. Like there's always going to be this inherent conflict where one side's going to look at the other and say, "Oh, you're a bunch of pretentious assholes. Like what's wrong with you? Why do you like this shit?" And then you got the other side saying like, "Oh, well, you're not willing to like stretch yourselves. You're just like taking like, Big Macs and just saying this is the greatest food ever, and like there's so much more out there. It's like richer," and like
maybe I'm a pretentious asshole.
Of the two, right? I don't know. I feel like I feel like we both straddle the line a little bit too, right? Like
I think if I was to like analyze myself, I think I absolutely do. I'm definitely not like as hypercritical as somebody who's critical, because I like to like films and I like to see. We've talked about the art commerce thing quite often, but I do think like often for me when I run into someone who it's just like maybe a lack of exposure, and that's always my thing. It's just like continue watching. Don't watch the same movies over and over. Don't read the same. I mean, unless that makes you happy and like maybe that's what art is all about. But to me, it's always been a journey of like exploring and understanding and like, maybe I'm a pretentious asshole.
I look at it this way too, man. I think that these people act like these tints are like have, if you want to like say that there's like different tints of art, like that there's like limited space and like you got to be over here with us and you can't be over there. And it's like, man, these tints are big. Like, make some room, like welcome people in. And like, I think admitting to the artistic value of something like A Knight's Tale and talking about it honestly is a good way to say like, all we're doing is applying the same kind of thing when we look at these other movies, and just like, you can find things by applying a critical mind to certain kinds of projects. And I can find things in A Knight's Tale, and I can find things in Marvel movies, and I can find things in other movies too. And it's not to say like they're better. It's just like one might be more rich and might have more there. And like, isn't it cool to do that? I don't know. That's kind of like, I think some of the philosophy behind our podcast, I would say. Yeah.
And I've said this a million times on the podcast, is like the idea of like, even if I hate a movie, I walk away with the experience of, why did I hate it? Mm-hmm. Or what did I like? What did I not like about it? And yeah, I've always found it strange that like people, like that's why I hate things like Rotten Tomatoes and a lot of these review aggregate kind of sites at this point, is that just make a decision on like yes or no for each individual. And reviews are important, especially like well thought out reviews are important in terms of like honestly telling people if it's worth their time, if that's something that's important to them. Like you said, like this podcast it's a journey of exploration. Like I'm trying to see what how they're adapting this work, and if it works, what is working, what's not working. And that's also like the filmmaker's perspective on it. I can take a step away from that at times and say, did I just, like, if I sat down and watched, am I enjoying what I want to watch this movie again? Am I enjoying watching it, or is it a chore? I think those are like key elements to outside of like, if you think this is a, some magnum opus of some filmmaker, or if you think it's like something that they threw together, in a weekend. I think it's important to note, like, where were you honestly like landing on it?
Well, and for this project in particular, you have one of the foundational pieces of art in the English language. And then you have this movie, right? And there's the big gulf between the two. And so the differences highlight the differences in genre, the differences in expectation behind the people making it, the differences in audience. And yet there's overlap, and it's fun to see that there is some overlap there with like what Chaucer was trying to do in his time.
Right.
I don't know, it's very cool.
With thinking about like Chaucer's kind of foundational like early English language work, and then moving into this film and how radically different they are. I think you'll find at the end of this episode, we've made a decision here, which is very abnormal for us at this point in the podcast, where we're not actually going to choose which one's better because they are so entirely different.
It's really just not even fair to try and judge them against one another.
It just seems so strange. And again, it's like, are you going to be the type of person that's like, this is more important of a work, like Chaucer's work is more important, so that makes it better.
Yeah, well, importance, there is no contest.
But does that make it better? And
right.
Like how do you compare the two?
Yeah.
You know. So anyway, let's move more into the plot and keep digging into this thing. Kate joins William's party and forges new light armor. In the following tournament, Admar and William are both assigned to tilt against Sir Thomas Colville, but they learn that he is actually Prince Edward, the heir apparent to the English throne. Unwilling to risk harming him, Admar withdraws, but William chooses to joust against Edward anyway and then addresses him by name, further earning his respect. Admar is called away to battle, and William achieves several victories in his absence. William proves his love for Jocelyn by complying when she first asks him to deliberately lose, in contrast to knights who promise to win, quote, in her name, and then just before he would be eliminated to win the tournament after all. The group travels to London for the World Championship. William recalls leaving his father to squire for Sir Ector and learn to become a knight, hoping to, quote, change his stars. Admar has also arrived in London and announces that he is in negotiations with Jocelyn's father for her hand in marriage. William dominates at the tournament, but is seen visiting his now blind father. Admar alerts the authorities to William's true identity. William is arrested and placed in the pillory, but is defended from the hostile crowd by his friends. Just as the mob reaches its frenzy, Prince Edward reveals himself. He acknowledges William's honor and an ability to inspire his friends' dedication that is in the best traditions of knighthood. Edward then announces that William is in fact descendant from an ancient noble family and knights him Sir William. William returns to the tournament to face Admar in the final match, but Admar cheats with an illegal sharpened lance, seriously injuring William. Entering the final pass, William is losing by 2 lances and must unhorse Admar to win. He tilts against Admar with his father and Jocelyn in attendance. Bellowing his true name as he charges, he knocks Admar to the ground with a crushing blow. With this final blow, William wins the World Championship. In the ensuing celebration, as Jocelyn and William embrace, Chaucer remarks that he should write an account of these events.
Which I guess is what we're watching now. Yeah, so this reminds me of another point I wanted to bring up, is how this movie also feels distinctly American to me.
It does, yeah.
There's something just very, like, and in a sense, I think one of the best things about American values can be how it's like the everyman, or every person, right? Being able to rise above their station, and how, like, the idea of nobility is bullshit, right? And this movie at its heart, I think, agrees with that. And it's like, we're calling it all bullshit. And so that feels very American to me, right? Like, it's anti-nobility, it's anti-royalty, it's anti-Britain in some ways. And yet...
but in so many ways is sort of about English culture and history, right?
Yeah, at the same time. Like, it's celebrating it, but also, like, bringing this American perspective to it. And I could see some critics probably getting upset about that, too. But, you know, for me, when I was young, at least, you know, it appealed to me. And now I like there's this definitely a fuck you to the rich attitude going on here, right? And I thought there was even, you know, like a cool part where Jocelyn is like, oh, we'll live with the pigs, like, it'll be fine. And William's like, you don't know, like, what you're talking about. Like, without coming just shy of saying, like, you've never actually been poor, but, like, I thought that was a cool moment, too, where it's like, you don't know what poverty is actually like.
Yeah.
And she doesn't. I don't know. Like, I think a lot of this stuff holds up really well, and there's definitely, like, a rise of the working class going on here a little bit, too. And they appeal to them, too, right? Like, oh, you know, he was born a stone's throw from this very, you know, whatever it is, wherever they're at, stadium. It wasn't the stadium, but whatever it was. And he's like, yeah, he's one of you, right? He's a commoner who has now been risen up. Now, of course, this stuff starts to fall a little flat when the whole idea is that, like, The way to
He
make
did
it is
Yeah.
is to enter into this new class and leave your old class behind, right? That's where we can kind of get into gets a little messy, but like ultimately,
Even in America these days, you've got like the billionaire like fucking lovers, the people who are like, oh my god, look at Elon Musk.
bootstrap
I gotta
yourself
be like him.
out of
Yeah,
poverty. Not that
right.
he did, but you know what I mean. Like that's the ideal, right? And then one day we'll be rich and we can leave it all behind. Cannot, by definition, be true for very many people.
Yeah.
Anyway, it makes for some good storytelling moments in a way that I think appeals to a lot of people, a lot of common folk who would be watching this movie.
I mean, and a lot of like fairy tales, medieval tales, these it's often like someone elevating to a different station, becoming king, becoming, a knight.
Although I will say, James Purefoy's character is he's an interesting one because he kind of subverts this a little bit, what we're talking about, because he is true nobility. He is true royalty, above the station of a lot of other characters. And he's shown to be genuinely honorable. And he's shown to be even more honorable than this other Adamar character, right? And he's kind of that perfect idealized blend. He's like the good king. He's the just king. He's the just... he's someone who seems to deserve the station he has because he's a good guy. And that sort of undercuts a lot of the messaging if you look at it that way.
Well, and he also just like Deus Ex Machina is this whole thing. Like he's not a god, obviously. Like,
well, they
he's,
set
like,
it up
saving
well
the day,
though with him. They've shown each other honor and like he's the ideal of a true knight. This is a true knight that William wants to be. And in these moments he's interacted with him, he's shown that to him. Like his unwillingness to back down. He's like, that's what a true knight is,
But he also just like is there in a guise, like in disguise. Which he keeps doing, which is again getting back to his character of like he is a noble who wants to acknowledges the fact that you can't live the normal experience unless you take on a name of someone else and pretend to be somebody else. So he kind of also like in the opposite direction understands what William's doing.
I mean, a couple other moments that stood out to me. I had forgotten about the like Nike swooshes that Kate puts on the armor. That was a funny little aside. Little thing there. I wonder if Nike paid a bunch of money to get into there, or if that was just something they did.
So the blacksmith mark that Kate puts on William's armor is the logo for Nike, providing product placement. Coincidentally, the founder of Nike is named Phil Knight. This was only brought to the filmmakers' attention after filming was completed. They had to show the scene to a Nike exec in order to get permission to use the swooshes, and the exec pointed out the coincidence.
Interesting. Okay.
Phil Knight.
So it was product placement, though.
It was.
Well, there you go. So you got to get your funding for your movie somehow, I guess.
It's interesting, though, because like Nike is a Greek god.
Is he?
Right? Or Roman god. Yeah, the god
Nike
of victory, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, clearly I'm not an expert on these things.
Victory, god of victory, Nike, mythology, Greek mythology, yep. Nailed it.
Okay. Oh, an interesting shot I wanted to get your take on here. There's a moment where after they've had this falling out, because at one point William just like, in my opinion, kind of abruptly, decides he's going to be a dick to Jocelyn. And all of a sudden he's like, calls her a silly girl. Oh, you're just a silly girl, aren't you? Right? And because she's talking about a flower, and he's like, "What good is a flower?"
That came out of nowhere. Yeah,
His
whole
kind of comes
outburst came out of nowhere.
Yeah, like where all of a sudden he's like hostile towards her.
Because he's like seeing the jousting as the most important thing at this point.
Right.
He's turning into
it's a
the
sign
rival,
that like his pride is getting the best of him and all this stuff, right? And then great line where she says, better a girl with a flower than a boy with a stick. And then Watt comes in with, "It's called a lance."
Yes.
Hello.
Which is funny to me because earlier I called it a spear. Stupidly. Of course it's a lance. Yeah.
Just the way he delivers it is really good. But anyway, this leads to this disconnect between them, and then they write the letter. And then there's this scene where he comes to her in a church, and it's shot from this really wide angle. And there's this whole like thing where he's sort of pursuing her and she's walking away from him.
Mm-hmm. And like a dollying sequence sideways.
They go through the church and there's different people in the backgrounds and stuff, and they go back and forth some, and they're having this whole conversation. And the conversation itself is about the distance between them, and he wants to win, and he's like, "I'm going to win this tournament for you," and she's like, "No." This is when she tells him, "You need to lose if you want to prove your love to me." I thought it was a clever way to show the distance between them. That's what I was getting from it. Like, we're showing distance, we're showing disconnect. But also, we're in a church and we're showing like almost like a Renaissance painting look at times for like how things look. Yeah.
I definitely picked up on that. It looked like a painting. And then something else that kind of sent me down a rabbit hole of thought is she talks about why she likes going to churches. And one of the reasons is for the colors, like looking at the stained glass. And it's so interesting to think about like a medieval time when things are dreary. Like she says, everything's dreary and dark and gray and this and that. And like to know that like that was an effective tool for churches of the time is to create things that are like larger than life and experiences that are larger than life. Like that's why these cathedrals and castles basically of these churches are so massive. It's just architecture that you couldn't see anywhere else, and the Sistine Chapel, like all these crazy things that you can see that are associated with the church. And like just even the stained glass of like seeing those colors brought people to have these like visual experiences, and like what an interesting effective tool
glass
that was used for religion, but it's art. Right, like someone created that art, and yeah, it's just an interesting intersection in the idea of like, of course, characters back then they had nothing else to do. They're looking at dirt piles, and then they're like, all right, let's go check out the stained glass that someone meticulously created.
So this ends up leading to him. He takes a bunch of hits right in the chest, and like he gets all beat up. And then she's like, "Now I want you to win." So he comes back and wins. And then one of the like weirder, creepier moments in the movie, where she comes to him and Chaucer just like comes walking out and he like looks at the camera basically and he's bed him well, Jocelyn. Like he says, as Guinevere did to Lancelot or something. It's so weird. Like,
it is weird, man. It's very weird. It'd be weird. It's one thing if you see something, you're just walking by and you're like, oh, you kind of, but then he's like, bed him well. He's earned it kind of thing. And you're just like, what the fuck is happening?
Very weird. We actually
he was really invested in their sex life, but
yeah. So I actually watched some deleted scenes from this movie randomly because we looked them up on YouTube afterwards. There's like a deleted scene where they walk in on Chaucer and he's like making love to his wife. His wife's randomly in the movie.
Who's walking in? What do you mean?
All of our other characters. They're like out on they're like out on the town and they see Chaucer. He's naked and he goes walking into a barn. And so they like go in there and they think he's like gambled to lose all of his clothes again. And he's like, no, she was hungry. And they're like, who? And she like throws the blanket over and it's his wife is like there. And she was an actress I recognized. I can't remember what from, but like it was somebody I recognized. Character was cut from the movie apparently.
So how was he to have a wife in this movie? Like
I think she was in. I think this might have been when they're in London or something, or one of the towns near London. I can't remember.
Okay, so like she has been in London the whole time, and he's just returning.
I think it's the night where Jocelyn comes to him. Okay. Maybe.
Okay. Yeah.
Anyway, weird deleted scene. There was a few deleted scenes I watched that I was like, I'm glad they cut these because a lot of them didn't need to be in there.
So you mentioned before that there is a follow-up story to The Knight's Tale, Chaucer's The Knight's Tale. And in that story, there's characters that are just like farting.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of like slapstick humor. Did you stay after the credits? Yeah, sorry. So I just like, I just left it playing. I'm writing notes in my phone and stuff while I'm letting it play.
I did not know that was there either. My wife knew and she told me, she's like, she showed it to me.
It popped up at the end and I'm like, oh, there's a post-credit scene? What the hell? And I'm watching it and it's just one big fart joke. And I'm like, what the fuck? Like, why even put that in there? But I don't know. I guess it's kind of funny. And maybe it is some puerile humor
from Canterbury Tales you're referencing.
Exactly. Yeah. Maybe it is the callback to like the story after the story is they're just like, I don't know, fart jokes and stuff.
But let's talk about more of the actual ending here. I thought the sequence was cool. The final fight. It's the first time where we see him actually cheat when he uses the. So I was thinking about it. I'm always like, what have we actually seen this guy do that's villainous? He made fun of him for wearing like out of fashion armor. So he was being a dick. And we've seen the way he talks about women. Like that's being a dick. Some of what we're told comes from Chaucer when it's like the things he's been doing when he's been out fighting and stuff, or it comes from like unreliable sources. And we've already seen at times that like his friends are willing to lie to him to get him angry, right? Yeah. So when we hear about him like apparently like pillaging the countryside, I'm always like, is that true?
Chaucer says it at one point and then he like enters frame and kind of agrees with it, like he is actually doing that.
Maybe.
I don't know if you remember in the final time.
Yeah. He
says like, that's what he's been doing and he shows up. So
but I had noticed earlier in the movie when he actually beats Will the first time, it plays some really ominous music as if he's going to do something nefarious, but he actually just wins. Like fairly, just beats him. And it's only later in the movie where you actually see him cheat. Right, and he also, of course, gets him arrested, which is another big way to cheat.
Well,
right?
Gets him arrested, meets him in prison, beats the shit out of him.
Yeah, that's when the true villain comes out, right? He's definitely a broad villain here. And then, there was a cool sequence where he gets knocked off the horse, and it shows him, and he's like floating over the ground, and then he sees them all lean in, and they like, repeat his own lines.
Yeah, I literally thought that was an effect because there were a few times that they were clearly using green screen technology. Like there's like backdrops.
I think he was like on a board or something, like just physically elevated off the ground.
I think so too, but it looked uncanny. Like when I was looking at it, I was like, it looks weird. And I guess that was an effect they were trying to create because he's like in mid fall or something. Like he's been knocked off.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's occurring to him mid fall. Yeah. And it's interesting because it's his own subconscious where they all lean in and say the thing that he said to him a bunch of times. It's like, I guess he knows he
hates himself, dude. I don't know what to say. Yeah.
Yeah. He knows he deserves it. And then of course he wins. Right. And it's funny because he takes his armor off, and I was like surprised that like other than, Mark Addy and they're the only ones who are like saying like, oh, I don't know if you should do this, but like nobody else seems to react to the fact that he's not wearing armor, which would be an incredibly dangerous thing to do.
That would be a rule.
Yeah, maybe against the rules. Yeah, but whatever. He wins anyway because at this moment he's not going to lose. Everything works out for him. We get kind of the epic finale, and we get a Chaucer saying, "No, maybe I should write this down," in a cool fourth wall moment. And that's The Knight's Tale, man. What a fun movie. I had a good time with it. Like I said, I think this thing has risen in my estimation over time. And this version in particular, this viewing in particular. Solidifying it as being what I'll consider a very good movie these days.
Same. I mean, I like this movie. Again, we're not talking about greatest movie I've ever seen or even approaching that territory.
Yeah,
it's fun though. I'd throw this on with a group of friends, just looking for a good time, especially
if you find some people who haven't seen it.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's an experience.
It's fun, especially for people like you said, our generation.
Yes.
I think it's speaking to those people for sure.
And I love the subtle ways in which it is playing with sort of the thematic elements, conceptually, what Chaucer was trying to do with the Canterbury Tales, the way he was looking at different classes. It's a very cool adaptation, and we're just gonna leave it at that. We're not gonna pick one or the other here. We're gonna say it's a very cool adaptation in a broadest of senses. Obviously, Chaucer's original stories are foundational to literature, so you can't really contest them in as far as importance goes. We'll leave it at that, I guess.
I do appreciate the film, too, because you've brought all to light the idea that like the filmmakers did intentionally draw in other elements, and there's some clever sort of allegory going on that maybe I was just like, oh yeah, that's just kind of where they wanted to go with it. But to know that was possibly tied back into Chaucer's is very cool. And so, another layer of intrigue in the film, I think there.
So if you enjoyed our coverage of A Knight's Tale, let us know in the form of a rating and review. And if you're on YouTube, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We would love to get some more subscribers, get up to 1,000. I think we're just a little short of that right now. It would be big for us. It's a big sort of milestone in a channel. So we'd love to have your help. And if you enjoyed this coverage, you should absolutely subscribe and wait for some more to come out.
And be sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, TikTok, pretty much anywhere we can be, we are.
All those at Ink to Film. We are also on Patreon, which we talked about earlier. That's how this project was chosen. It was chosen by our patrons every quarter. They get together, they vote on dedicated polls for what we're going to cover, and it's always a fun one. And this was no exception. This was perfect. Really enjoyed covering this one. So if you want to get in on the fun, patreon.com/inktofilm.
And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, that's going to be it for this week. Next week, we're going to be recording a Patreon episode. So if you're a patron, once again, you'll get access to that. It'll be on Patreon. And then after that, we'll be back with, we're hoping, is going to be a very cool special guest episode that is something we haven't been able to do a lot of, but maybe another creative conversation. So if you liked our episode we did with Paul Tremblay, make sure to stick around for that, because this should be a really fun one.
Our creative conversations are something we want to do more and more often. It's very cool to have the creators involved come on and join us.
All right, so that's going to be it for A Knight's Tale. So until next time,
keep adapting.